It's Alabama Annie coming to you from the kitchen of the old home place on a hot summer night, and it's nice and dark outside and the stars are out. It's the perfect night to tell you a story. So this story is about a man named Rudy Stokes and an adventure he had around the turn of the early 1900s and his encounter with the little people. And I'll be reading it so you will see the glare of my laptop in my glasses. Unavoidable. But here we go. Rudy Stokes had been in trouble most of his life for one thing or another. Mostly petty crimes that landed him in the pokey from time to time, but when he stole a Model A Ford from a visitor to his hometown and crashed it into the side of Clara Lee's house early one morning because he didn't know how to drive it, he found himself once more standing before Judge Ramey, a man who was tired of seeing him every couple of months in his courtroom. Judge Ramey sentenced Rudy to 1 year hard labor on the county chain gang. The convicts were roused early one morning and sent off to work down along the east brow of Lookout Mountain, clearing brush and cutting trees for a new leg of the railroad. After days and days of working in the hot summer sun, bitten from head to toe by mosquitoes and covered in a rash of poison oak, Rudy made up his mind that he was going to run. He crept off from the workout one windy night in his worn boots, dungarees, and striped prison shirt, while the two deputies sat beside the fire arguing about the weather and who would do the midnight bed check. Rudy lit out through the woods along the roadbed, following a trail that took him off east away from the workout. He was headed toward Hentown, and he'd gone a good distance when he came up on a small farm at the foot of a hill. There were clothes hanging on a line, and Rudy ran into the yard and snatched a shirt and some socks. In a pine thicket, he shed the convict shirt and put on the new one. He buried the convict shirt best he could in a pile of pine needles and went on. He kept thinking if he could make Hentown by morning, pretty little Millie DuPont would surely take him in and feed him some of her fine biscuits and gravy. The wind died down and the moon was high and the clouds drifted over and it lit the forest so he could see his way clear among the trees and the rocks. He was making good time and thought he might make Hentown by morning, but the trail took him down into a hollow. The moon didn't reach through the thick canopy of trees down there as he descended among huge rocks, and he could hear a creek running below and headed toward that sound. Rudy stood looking for a place to cross the creek when he came to its edge. He could see the moon again, its light dancing off the water. The water was fast and it looked deep. He looked left. Huge boulders blocked his path. He looked downstream and saw what appeared to be a trail of sorts that rounded a bend in the creek. Best to follow the water, Rudy thought to himself. At least he was able to see his way along, but then the wind began to blow, and dark clouds obscured the moon, and he was moving between very tall cliffs, and near darkness he carefully moved on, but slipped on some rocks. Rudy gasped to see he was only inches away from a sheer drop down to the water. He scampered back from the edge, but he was too late and his foot slipped, and Rudy Stokes screamed. He was falling. Rudy Stokes awoke on the bank of the river beside a huge boulder on a sandbar. There was sand in his mouth and his eyes, and he could taste blood from a busted lip. He was afraid to move. It felt as though every bone in his body might be broken. No one would ever believe what he had been through, and he didn't want to die there beside the water. He knew something was wrong with one of his legs. He suddenly jerked himself awake into a sitting position and tried to wipe the sand from his eyes. His ears were ringing and he felt dizzy, but at least he could see. The moon was out again. He got up the nerve and stood, but the pain was terrible. "I got to get up and get out of here," Rudy said aloud, looking around for anything to grab to support himself. He spied a sturdy tree branch to his left. He reached out for it, grabbing hold of the branch. He pulled it to him. Then with much crying and grunting, Rudy managed to get himself into a crouched position, half standing, half kneeling, shaky and unsteady as he leaned on the branch for support. After a moment, Rudy began to move slowly along the edge of the river. He paused to rest here and there before crossing a flat stone at the water's edge when A high-pitched scream split the night. It came from somewhere behind him, and it made his heart skip a beat. His hair stood on end. He froze, clinging to the stick for balance as he craned his neck to see behind him. He told himself it must have been a screech owl and said to himself, "You're a chicken." He gained his confidence again that he could get himself out of this mess, but then the scream came again, only this time it was much closer than before. As he stumbled and halted in his tracks, a third scream, even shriller than the others, came from ahead of him. He jerked his head from side to side, looking for a way out of this mess he found himself in when he saw them. 3 fast-moving figures, no taller than small children, rushed toward him. They surrounded him, speaking in gibberish and low growls that sent a chill through his very soul. One of them snatched his stick away with a long, bony hand, while another shoved him down onto the sand, and the third screeched again, only inches from his face. Rudy heard himself scream then, although it seemed the sound had come from somewhere else. He couldn't believe he would make a sound like that. He closed his eyes, hoping he'd open them to find he was in the convict camp again in his own bed, but when he opened them, the creatures were still there. They were dragging him, tugging him by his dungarees and ripping at his shirt. The sand and the rocks scratched his belly as they drug him along. They pulled and tugged him over the edge of the cliff. They tugged him up toward the jagged edge of the rocks. His head bumped here and there, and a tree scratched his leg. His injured leg dangled awkwardly. Briars ripped his skin and tangled in his hair as they dragged him through the bushes and the brambles into a small clearing. Rudy found himself beside a fire laying on the bare ground. A snarling sound came to him, and he turned his head. Now there were more of them, ripping apart the charred remains of some animal with their jagged teeth. One of them tried to shove a piece of the bloody meat into his mouth. Rudy coughed and gagged. He screamed again, and he fell unconscious. He awoke at dawn in the clearing where the fire had been. As he came to himself and looked around, he saw that he was naked. He saw the ground around him was littered with bones and other terrible things he could not identify, and the smell was awful. But the nasty little creatures who had dragged him into that clearing were gone. Relieved somehow, Rudy began to cry like a baby when he heard the distant sound of dogs. Their baying was like music to his ears as the search party came through the forest. "Here, boss! Here, boss!" he shouted. The sheriff and his men came into the clearing, sidestepping the bloody remains of animals and bones to reach him. Rudy could not stand or walk on his own, so they made a litter to carry him out. He awoke several days later in the county infirmary, grateful to be alive and safe. His broken leg and shoulder was mended. When the sheriff asked him what had happened, Rudy was afraid to tell him the truth. He didn't think the sheriff or anyone else would believe he'd been attacked by a group of flesh-eating little people. When he tried to sleep, Rudy dreamed that the ugly little creatures were tugging and pulling on him once more. He would wake up in the ward screaming most nights. Finally, when the doctor said Rudy could be released from the infirmary, the sheriff came to take him back to the jail. And on the short ride there, the sheriff said to him, "You know, Rudy, you're really lucky. You got out of there with your life. Ain't nobody much ever comes back from Little Man Holler." Rudy kept to the jail, afraid of the forest, afraid of the night, and afraid he might see them again. And just when he was beginning to feel better, a circus came to town. The other convicts and the sheriff talked Rudy into going with them to see the show. But at the show, there were little people in the circus performing under the big top, leaping and hopping about in the circus ring, and they terrified Rudy all over again. After that excursion, Rudy became a trustee of the county and lived out his days within the confines of the jailhouse grounds, the building, and his cell. So there we have the story of Rudy Stokes and the little people in Little Man Holler. Now here's the song I wrote to go along with this story. And I've only played it a couple times, so if I mess it up, I'll start over. It's called Down in Little Man Holler. Little Man Holler ain't a place to be. You need to mess around. Don't let yourself get caught down there when the sun goes down. Oh, there's danger in the shadows, danger in the trees. The moans and moans will bring you to your knees. Something on the wind, Little Man Holler. Yeah, there's danger in the wind, danger on the breeze. Trouble in the holler and trouble in the trees. Go down there, you just might never come back again. Little Man Holler ain't a place to be. You need to mess around. Don't let yourself get caught down there when the sun goes down. There's danger in the shadow, danger in the wind. You go down there, you won't come back again. Little Man Holler ain't a place to be when the sun goes down. Said Little Man Holler ain't a place to be when the sun goes down. There we have this episode. Thank you for being here.